So here we are in the fourth video, and this one's going to be focusing on the rendering of our Infectio project. And of course we've cached all that data down and we can actually scrub through a little bit now. But now we're going to take a look at the actual rendering of these things. And it's going to be fairly simple because we're not pulling too much information from the particles and stuff. We might take some random color from them, that kind of thing, or maybe and some trail data for these spores. But really it's going to be quite a basic material. If you're used to just doing sort of standard rendering. So let's take a look at our scene. I've actually got some lights in this scene. So, well, let's throw a camera on. And I always like to have a camera in the scene. I can add it to that layer. And we could add it with a cycles camera tag. Now, there is a quick button. If you want to do that in one go, if I delete that camera, if you go to the cycles menu, there is actually an option to add a camera. And all that does is it adds the Cinema 4D camera with the cycles tag already assigned in the view that you're currently looking at. So that's just a quick way of doing that. And I'm probably just going to use this as my viewport camera. And if you've seen any of the other videos, I tend to use one of these just to diagnose the scene and fly around and just test things out. So firstly, let's go to my cycles layout. Cycles 4D, there we go. And I'm running two of my GPUs. This is my display GPU. I like to leave that out so performance remains nice and snappy. You can include the display GPU. It's not a problem. It's just if you've got the option, why not? There we go. Okay, so this is looking a little different to the viewport scene that we have here because I've already assigned some materials, and I think we should just take a look at those a minute to understand exactly what's going on here. So we've got some lights in the scene. Obviously, I've set this up very basic. We've got a couple of, these are kind of kick lights actually, just catching sort of rim lights, catch lights, that kind of thing. And I don't want the skull to be like super clearly visible. I want the mold that's going to grow on it to be more of the focus here. And we're probably never going to bring the camera, well, probably we might bring the camera around this side, but most of the action is going to occur from this side. And then eventually we're going to end up overlooking it. Now, if I scrub along in the timeline just to like where it's all filled up, we'll get an idea of what we're aiming for here. So we're going to have the camera settling on our biohazard symbol probably about here. And we'll probably have a longer lens for that. But for now, we're going to play around with the materials. And if you notice, we're only seeing the mold, if you want to call it that. Let's just quickly take a look at the scene materials. We've just got some very simple cycles materials. If I jump into geometry here, we've got this skull material. It's a principled matte, slightly glossy. It's got some roughness to it. And then it's got this swirly noise. So if I solo that, you can see it's got this noise that's slightly distorted. And I'm using the object as the texture coordinates. Let's go back to the beginning so there's no other stuff there. There we go. And the ground material, very similar. And if you look at the ground material, it's not the highest res sculpt at all, but I'm bringing in detail using the material. So if I jump into that ground material, we can have a look. Now this area here, I'm using it to fade off the boundary of this area because it's not a lit surface, it's actually quite a reflective surface. So if I left it without this, so if I just turn that off, you'll see that this is the boundary and it's going to be quite hard to avoid seeing that boundary. So there's a trick to fade off the floor. So all I'm doing here, if I solo this layer, you can see we've got this noisy edged gradient, radial gradient. And if we go through each stage, texture coordinates, this is obviously, I'm taking the object size of this whole thing, and it's kind of very simple. Then I'm scaling that up so that I can, it's basically scaling the gradient texture itself. But if I solo this actually, if I go to the gradient texture, and if I mute this divide, you'll see that's the gradient. And this scale value here is actually going to scale the gradient. So whatever I do here, it's going to change the size of that gradient. But I don't want it to be that kind of wide out, and I also want to break up that edge. So instead of like multiplying a noise onto the gradient, I'm actually distorting the UV. And I'm doing that by taking this noise texture here. Oops, let's click on there. And I'm using an alpha here just to, a color ramp just to kind of tighten up the color a bit. And then if I go to this mix here, you can see that there's a bit of that noise coming through over the top of our UV. So basically, if I unsolo that and we connect that, I just solo that actually, there we go. And then this gradient here, if I left it over here, you'd see it's a bit more of a softer fade out. I wanted it to make sure that there's full opacity here and then that it fades out around the edges. But if I mess around with this divide here and I go to like a full level, you'll see it cuts back into the gradient way more. So it's almost like I've got a control of an edge that kind of eats away at our gradient. And if I undo that, just so that I get back to that value that I was happy with, and then I just reconnect that up to a mix. And the mix is actually just mixing a transparent BSDF with our principled. The principled is similar to our skull material with a few more noises in it, sort of fine noises, that kind of thing. You can explore these if you like. If not, they're here and ready to go if you need them. You could change these materials out for anything you want, to be honest. I quite like this dark sort of look. I'm also, just to show you what I'm doing for the lighting, that purple sort of tint there is actually coming from the environment. And if I jump to the no layer, now this is a bit of a crazy node layout, but it's quite easy to understand once I go through the steps. So currently, I actually have a gradient texture in the sky. Oh, I'm actually hiding it. So if we click on that HDR environment and we go to ray visibility and hit camera, you'll see if I zoom out and then if I look up, it's a white to black gradient top to bottom. And I'm also mixing a noise in. You can see that's actually affecting there. And then if I solo this one, I've got a gradient that has a knot at 50% and it's black. So that's going to be the horizon line essentially. And then I can bring the horizon, the white value down so it ends up there. Then I'm ramping that with these two sort of color bands. And this was a look I was dabbling with sort of earlier. And you can tweak this color super easy. Once you've done that, you can put it through this HSV, this hue saturation value node, and it allows you to tweak the colors after you've done all that stuff. So that's cool. But I don't want it to be visible. I could have it sort of blurred out with depth of field and stuff, but I just wanted it to drop a kind of a tint on the whole sort of object. I'm going to undo till I'm back to where I was. There we go. And just hide that again using the ray visibility in the environment object. There we go. And that's pretty much the basics of what I was going for. I've got a spotlight in here, and the spotlight is really just to boost our, if we look here, I've just got a few lights quite simply set up. I'm using the spotlight here to boost anything that's on the surface. So if we scrub along a bit to say 250, you can see that's getting quite a big boost from that spotlight. And I'm going to make this yellow and probably have a bit of subsurface scattering. So that's what we should do first, is actually address the material of this slime mold. So let's, we can just have a look at it up here. I want it to be quite disgusting looking, so you've got to use a bit of subsurface scattering for that kind of thing. And so we'll add a new material under cycles, and we can just drop an object material in because it's going to be using the principled node. And let's rename this. Let's call this Psy Mold. It's going to be a slime mold. So I probably should say slime mold because those are very different things. A lot of molds kind of have that fur on them, so they're quite diffuse. But we're kind of dealing with a fantasy sort of slime mold. Okay, so I want the color to be something. Oh, I should assign it actually. So we could just drag it in the viewport here. Just assign it to our. There we go. And now our object is all shiny. And I want it to be kind of a yellow color. Slime molds have this really quite vivid yellow like that. And if I zoom out, and you can see the sort of band of color that I have in the skylight is looking quite cool on that. And that looks like a pretty toxic looking color. And I quite like the balance of the yellow against the black on this, so that was quite cool. Definitely looks like dangerous stuff. And that's actually looking pretty cool. I might just up the roughness a touch. It's at 0 at the moment. So let's just up that a little bit and then see how that looks. Okay. And then I want to actually work out some kind of subsurface stuff here. Now, what I tend to do is, first things first, with these two options here for Christensen-Burley and random walk, I always select random walk nowadays. It's the other one is quicker, but the random walk is just such a nicer look. So if I increase the subsurface mode, or slider I should say, you get this very quick and nice looking subsurface scattered material, but obviously it's set to this subsurface color here. Now we could just, if I want it to look somewhat like it did before, we can just drag, I could select this color and just sample that one like so, and that'll start to look a little bit more like the color we had. But you'll notice if I zoom in here, if I actually drop the environment off so that we're getting a bit more of a, there we go. So we get a bit more true representation of the colors and things. Okay, we can see it's kind of getting washed out, and that's because the subsurface scattering is allowing it to the radius, it's allowing to go through the material quite far. So we want to restrict that somewhat. So we want these to drop down quite a lot. And you can actually think of this as almost like a color, the search radius, because if you do different in each of these X, Y, and Z values, you'll actually get a different looking color, and you can actually get some really nice looking materials out of this. So we can see the green is kind of coming through there, but on the outside down here, you can see it's actually going through to red. So it's leaving like a green value, but it's actually, and there's a red one on this side. I think we'll probably want to go a bit more subtle than that. So maybe, what if I drop this right down? It's quite a vivid color at the moment, so perhaps that's not helping us. Maybe if I drop that to, but I quite like that look. If I turn the skull off, actually, if I turn the geometry off here, we'll really see. Let's go up to some of these bits here. Can you see that red color coming through there underneath? That's looking pretty cool, actually, and pretty disgusting. So you can see in the shadow here, and it's actually leaving this kind of greeny, slimy looking material, but it's kind of got this warm red color on the inside. So I might keep that, quite like that. Let's just bump and play around with those. If we drop this color down to like a low color, we'll still get the reddening and the green, because this is the red. If you look here, you can think of this as RGB. You can see that is what we're getting from this remaining stuff here. That actually looks quite cool, but I want to make it, an organic color. If you go to something that's a bit too, let's swap some of these around. So let's put the 0.25 in the green. It's going to look pretty interesting, but it's a fairly artificial color, and that might suit your project. But I'm gonna go for this yellow because I quite liked it. So that's the yellow subsurface. And then we want the red for the radius. There we go. Maybe that is a bit high. There we go. And you can see that's actually letting less light through as well, because it is a radius. So if I increase that, it's going to let a lot of light through. Mostly red there. And this is going to let a lot of the... Let's divide it by 2. Okay. No, I'm going to go back to it allowing a lot of light through, because when the geometry's back on, I think it looks better with the... There we go. See, because we're not getting the red unless it's sort of catching the surface here. That's looking pretty interesting. Read somewhat horrible. The roughness value I think is probably just about right. We could go a little higher. If you go too high, it'll start looking non-glossy. And that's quite interesting, but I want it to kind of look slimy. So I'm going to drop the roughness down quite a bit. And then the IOR, the index of refraction, we could have that so it's a little subtler, or actually a lot of organic stuff tends to be sort of have a lot of water in it. So 1.33 is the index of refraction of water. So I tend to use that quite a bit for organic materials. You can definitely look up those values online if there's a known property inside this. The reflection is a bit over bright at the moment, I would suggest. So we could drop down the specular. We drop it right down. Let's see if that kills it off a bit. It might just be that one light that's actually doing that, so we might leave it higher. Now it's looking a bit flat, so... Oops, wrong one. Let's leave it up about 0.3 or 4. Okay, that's looking interesting. And we might boost these lights, remember. If we need to, I could bring in this spotlight and have it boost up a little bit more. You can actually see the spot there a bit more. Here we go. We could always jump into the cycles light tag and increase the strength multiplier. But actually, I don't want to go too far with that. I'm going to undo those steps actually, because I quite like the softness of this. I don't want to go too far pumping the brightness. I just want it to be quite subtle. And we'll also, when the spores are in here, we'll see how they look as well. Okay, so I'm actually quite happy with how the slime is looking. The slime mold, I should say. If we zoom in and let that resolve for a second. That's looking quite nice. We've got a very warm light on that at the moment, actually. So if I turn that warm light off and we go to an area where it's just kind of the pure white light, that's a more accurate representation of what it looks like. Pretty disgusting. I like the contrast between the detailed texture surface and this slime. Looks pretty disgusting. Okay, so that's a bit dark there without that warm kick light. All right, and now the last thing I want to do is I'm going to give it a bit of a texture to it. So at the moment it's kind of this very, very smooth surface, but maybe we want to give it a bit of a mottled noise texture. So we can just add in, let's add in a noise. So I might add a couple of noises. I might do a standard noise and a Voronoi noise. So I'm going to add those both in. If I solo them out, it gives me kind of an easy representation and I know what I'm looking at in the viewport, in the real-time preview. And at the moment the scale's too large, but also I want to make sure that I'm using the geometry to take the texture coordinates from. So if we get filter to texture coordinates, drop that in. I'm actually just going to grab object, and you can see if I click that, we'll get a value from, well, it's X, Y, and Z. So the green is Y, the red is Z, obviously. But remember, it's a UV, it's like a automated UV, just generates it based on the object size and things like that. So I'm going to pipe that into both of these noises. We might use some mapping to scale them down. But there we go, that's just changed them slightly. And what we can do is we can increase the scale here. You're increasing the size of the window that you're looking at the noise, if you think about it like that. So we're zooming out, essentially. We're increasing the size of the image that we're seeing, and in reality is what's generating. So that would look a little bit dry, I think. If it's kind of using that crackle texture, we can just filter through some of these, take a look. Not very organic looking, so I probably would just go with maybe one of our standard closest here, which is kind of, you see how that's much more natural looking, like cells. And I haven't actually looked that close at the fungal stuff, so it might not look exactly like this, but what I might want to do is I might want to invert that with a ramp so that I can pump it into the bump map, and it'll actually be sort of the white parts will be crevices. So let's do that. Let's grab a bump, drop that in there, and then we just need to connect up the Voronoi texture. Now, in this case, if I click on factor or color, they're both the same. But in some of the other settings, if I hit cells here, you'll see that that's multicolored. So if I just go back to intensity, it doesn't matter which one you use, but for this, just to be safe, I'm going to put it into that. There we go. And then let's connect up that normal, that bump output to this BSDF, the principal BSDF. And right away we can see we're getting an interesting look, but it's not, it's a bit too crystalline. There we go. Let's drop the strength down quite a bit. And you start to see it starts to round off a bit. But also we want to invert that. Now I could just invert the bump, but I might be wanting to bring in other noises that'll be the right way around. So for now I'm just going to use a ramp because I find this the most convenient way to do things. If you know me, you know I love a ramp. And we can grab the ramp and we can invert the gradient. And now they're pillows, they're sort of cells sticking out. So if I zoom out a bit, can you see that? It's now looking like a really disgusting, well, up here it looks like a can of baked beans. Down here it looks like really horrible scaly cells. Yeah, that's starting to look as repugnant as I'd hoped. So let's have a look at something else actually. If I go into this color ramp, you can see where I'm ramping it, I'm not using a linear ramp. So it actually has changed the way that these pillow. So if I click linear, that's now back to where it was, although the inverse of the noise, but that's a bit sharp. So actually using the smooth ones is probably quite nice. I could use cubic as well, and you'll see it'll just soften the transitions between stuff. But if I go for a smooth one here, and if I solo that layer again, and I could bring in this much tighter, I can have those cells kind of only in certain areas. Now, I think I'm quite happy with them being all over the place, but if you wanted it to tighten in certain areas, there we go. And then I'm going to use this noise down here. Let's increase the scale of the noise surface. There we go. Maybe really high. I probably want quite a, well, let's go for a medium frequency. It's good to have sort of large, medium and small frequency noises kind of stacked on top of each other. So what we'll do is we'll probably blend this one with the color ramp. So we'll get a mix RGB node, connect that up to the height instead, and then connect these two up here. Make sure it goes into factor, remember. And as is, that will just be a 50% blend between the two. If we zoom in, that's not very evident. So we want to use something a bit more aggressive, maybe like overlay. Something like that. Although that's a medium-sized noise, wasn't it? So it won't be very... If I multiply. There we go. So you can see I'm actually taking... Those pillows are actually getting multiplied over with a larger scale noise. And then I'll probably grab another noise. So we could actually just select these two because we need to mix another set in. It's all about layering up these noises. So I'm going to actually take... Oh, actually, yeah, we want to do that. We want to take this one into that mix and then there. And then this noise here, we've got to connect up to our UVs or our generated textures. And we don't want it to be the same sort of texture. We want it to be a slightly different one. And I want to increase the scale of it so it's a finer noise. Let's solo it. And I also want to increase the detail. And then I want to distort it. Now the distortion adds a really kind of like organic sort of flowing, swirling, and maybe give it a hint of a fluid. There we go. Let's just click on this. That's looking not too bad. Let it resolve. Always let if you've got fine noises in your scene, you're going to want to let the render resolve a little bit before you decide whether that noise is good enough, because it might be missing the high frequency noise just because the render itself, it might be a bit noisy. So we're not going to be coming up too close to this stuff, but I think probably, well, maybe we will actually. It looks quite good. So let's, another thing to say is we could just temporarily add, say, well, let's say we could use a diffuse BSDF instead, just temporarily, just to diagnose the bump. So you can see that bump's a bit more clearly now. And if I drop the factor on this multiply right down, you can see the texturing, the blend, I can have it do this. So I can just have it subtle, like so. I'm pretty happy with that. I think this noise here is probably a little too subtle. I might drop the scale back down, increase the detail a touch, and add a bit more distortion to that as well. It's a bit too aggressive. There we go. And that'll just add some larger frequency noise over the whole thing. And let's go back to our principled. And that is looking thoroughly disgusting, and I like it. We might also want to add a noise to the color itself, although I feel like we're getting enough texture and noise through the shader itself. So I'm going to leave that as is for now, and we might come back to that once we've dealt with these spores. Okay, so let's zoom out. I am liking that. It's looking cool. Let's zoom right in. Let it resolve for a second just to make those decisions. Now, remember, this side of the scene has a lot more light, so we're getting a lot more penetration of the subsurface scattering of the light rays. And like I said, we could always reduce those down. If I divide that by 2, I can actually bring these up. If I bring these 2 up, it'll start to temper the red color a little bit. That was maybe too much. Yeah, you see, I keep changing it, and then on this side, I want it to go back to where it was. So let's undo a couple of steps. There we go. And you can see just there, you're getting the red coming through, and it leaves this bluey green color. Well, it's leaving blue really, but blue and green both. So that's looking pretty cool. Okay, and if we just line up just for fun, just to see what it looks like at the end. Yeah, I'm liking that. Like I said, I might boost that light on the right, or we could, in post, we might be boosting it using that kind of technique. But let's take a look at the spores now. So we've dealt with this, and I'll leave that mesh on for now, but we're going to keep it quite simple for these materials. And I think the first one we're going to deal with, let's deal with the trail, the stem of these spores. So first of all, let's create a basic material. Go shaders. Do we even need object shader? I think perhaps we could even just do diffuse for these. So I'm going to use a diffuse. And let's grab this and let's change that to a yellow color as well. Maybe a slightly different yellow to this one so it stands out. But I want them to kind of feel like they're part of the same element. And maybe you'll change that color. It's up to you entirely. And we're going to apply that to our trail, our spores trail here. Now, automatically that detects, Cycles detects that a material has been assigned and will just automatically start creating the trail object itself. Now, I don't want it to create a trail as thick as that. So what we need to do is we need to add a Cycles trail tag onto this. So if I right click, Cycles, or Cycles curve tag, I should have said, sorry. And then now I have control over the thickness of these. So at the moment it's obviously insanely large. There we go. And I think we could probably go a lot thinner than that. So I mean, probably micro size. So maybe just half that. Like so. Just load in. There we go. And that's looking pretty interesting. Now, we've currently got it in the default render settings. So if I jump into our render settings, open that up here. It's currently set to standard. Let's change it to cycles. So we now have access to cycles render settings. I'm just going to expand that out a bit. And we don't need to think too much about this. This will probably be increased at the end, so that's probably good to change. If I go to performance and tiles, that's fine. Don't need to worry. It's set to CPU at the moment, so change it to CUDA. If you have CUDA devices, of course. I do. There we go. And then the thing we're looking for here is actually the curve rendering. And currently it's set to line segments. Let's change it to curve segments. And we should see a little bit of a change. And you can see, I'll let it resolve a second. They're a little bit smoother, but also they're kind of they're connected. If you saw when it was much larger, those line segments are not connected. If it's this small, it's not so much of a problem, so we might go back to that. But for now, I'm going to set it to curve segments, and I'm going to make the curve subdivisions, well, let's do 3. Just to ensure they're nice and smooth, even in the close-ups. So if I zoom out, we actually see our scene is now looking a little bit more interesting. We have this gross looking fur growing off our molds as well. I might reduce that size down even more, although that's not too bad. We'll test it out once we've got the spores on the end as well. So if I drop it too much, I'm just going to drop it another half, so I'm dividing by 2. It's regenerating the splines, the new curves, and then feeding it into the system. And there you go. That's a bit more subtle. So I quite like that, although it might require a few more samples to render it to make sure they're nice and clear. That's looking pretty cool though. I like that. Zoom in. We'll definitely have some close-up shots. Depth of field will make these look a lot more interesting as well. Okay, so we've got those set up. What we could do is we could add a hair info node. So if we go over here and we could even just filter. So if I just go to input and then it's hair info node. And what this will allow us to do is actually access some, even though it says hair, and this is kind of looking like hair, but it's just splines. So really this is, you could think of this as spline info node or curve info node. And you can see that we're getting a gradient along the strands, the trails or stems, and we can actually ramp that color. So if I throw that in here and then solo the color and the ramp, you can see that's not changed much because it's a black and white gradient. But we want to maybe sample this yellow that we've got here. I think it might be a bit more muted than that, perhaps. Drop it down like that. And let's set another one at the other end. And I think perhaps I want it to be, because this left-hand side of this gradient is the start of the stem. Maybe we want that to be a bit more warm. Maybe if I just sample a color out of here. Oh, wow, interesting. That pixel I just selected was green, just whilst it was processing. So here we go. Hit OK. And that might just ground them a bit more into the surface. That's quite cool. Connected up to our diffuse now. And let's solo that back out. Oh, they're quite red there. So that's probably the light cast on them. Let's zoom in here. I am quite liking the look of that. We could even add some variation in the color of them as well. So we could we can randomize them a little bit, and I'll show you how to do that as well. Let's zoom back in over here. So this is probably the best area to look at. Remember to let the render resolve a touch before making any changes, because it might be a fine noise or a fine detail that you're missing. That's looking pretty good though. I like that. It'll look a lot different with the spores on the end, of course, but I'm quite liking this. Now, like I said, maybe we want to randomize the color a touch. So let's do that. What I can do is I could have this random. So if I solo that, you'll see that we'll get a random like black to white color on every single spline. So it counts the number of splines and then assigns a value from 0 to 1 randomly amongst them. And what we can do with that is we can actually have that drive another color ramp, like so. Or even, actually, let's try something even more, a bit more interesting. Let's have it drive a hue saturation. Let's grab an HSV, grab that, connect that up there and solo that. And if I'll let that just do its thing, load it up. I might go back to the beginning actually, where it's a bit earlier on, so that the it loads quicker. Here we go. Let's go to frame 50, where some of them are fully extended on the nose there. Awesome. There we go. And so we can kind of just diagnose this area of the mesh now and play around here. And so what I've got here is I've got the HSV, and if I rotate this, or if I take this hue value and I slide it from from 0 to 1, 0.5 is the 0 point, and then everything around it, 0.5 value each way, is going to be our variation. What we can actually do, if I just plug the random into that right now, it's not going to quite work. It's going to just give us a completely full range of random colors from 0 to 1. And that might be desirable, but what if I want to clamp that value or fit that into a range? Well, we have this group that I've created for this training series called Range Mapping Group. I also use this all day, every day. And what it does, and we actually have a separate video of this group, and we'll include the group as well. What we do is we have an input value, and we can remap that. So if you want to understand exactly how to build this, there's a separate bonus video you can find with the training series. And let me just plug that into the hue. Now, to understand what this is doing, we just have to think of it this way. So we've got these two input values and two output values. Currently, the input max and output max is 1. The input min and the output min is 0. And what that means is nothing is happening. So what we want to do is we want to set the range to be around that 0.5 value, quite close to that 0.5 value. So we've got our input of our black and white colors from 0 to 1. We know that the random colors are 0 to 1, but we want to remap those so that they can only map within, like, say, 0.4 and 0.6. So let's try that. And you'll see this will be just a subtle, there you go, a much more subtle shift around that hue saturation value. And I think we could probably even go higher than that. Make it very subtle. That's too subtle. Let's drop to 55 and 45. There we go. So that's now given us a nice subtle randomization, and the same applies for all those other parameters in the hue saturation value. If I duplicate this and I connect this up to the saturation, this is a 0 to 1 value. So if I set that to 0 to 1, you see it, we saturate down to grey or whites where it's random. So we don't want that. We want to leave that where it was. Ooh, let's disconnect that. And I think the hue shift is all we need there. So I'm going to unsolo that, have it feed into our diffuse, and let's check out what that's looking like. Let's put our it's a bit dark again, so we can put our environment back on again, I think, at this point, because that's going to dictate the look as well. And let's nudge it along. There we go. So I quite like how the purple brings a bit more of an extra tone into this. All right. It's looking quite interesting. So I think we'll move on to the actual spores themselves. I'm quite happy with how the spore stems are looking. I guess call them stels or milum, I think it is. But if I jump up here and we've got our spores, I'm going to add a cycles instance tag. Now I could just add a standard material. Oh, I should name these. So let's call this trail spores, or spores trail, either way. And I'm going to create a new material. Now these, I could make these glossy. I think I'll just use I'll use an object material, and then we can decide whether to have any specular in it or not. So this is always a nice thing to have. It won't cost you anything. It's just organizational. This is quite a lot of stuff when you don't, if you just needed the diffuse. So that's why I chose it in the last thing. Either way, let's throw this material onto our spores, and let's just call this size spores. Now you can see they are working out quite nicely. And if I zoom along to a different timeline, part in the timeline, you can see they are respecting the scale of their source particle, but they're quite large, and I think too large. So we'll want to scale these down, but instead of having to recache everything, it's got this really nice thing where we can scale them down in a tag. So if I go to cycles, instance, And you'll see that we've got these sphere segments and stuff like that. We're not worrying about that just now, but I'm going to replace that with some custom geometry. Let's drop the size down. I want it to go right down, so it's really subtle. 30%. That might be a bit, I don't know, actually, that might be a bit too small. Let's tweak it to 50%. There we go. And if you remember, I said about the size variation, I could actually have them vary wildly in size. That might be quite nice. Let's go 25%. There we go. And they'll still be relative to the particle radius, so they'll grow with the particle size and stuff like that. But I'm liking how that's looking. That's really cool. But what I want to do now is I actually want to change the geometry on the end of one of these. So I need to zoom right into one of these. So that's a little tricky. One little tip actually is if you, depending on your navigation style, I'm using a Wacom, it's the same with a mouse. If you want to zoom into something like that tight, it's sometimes good to put an object there and be able to kind of grab that object and orbit around it. Or if you just put snapping on, and vertex snap like there. Can you see you'll get a moment where you'll know where you're around there. Let's do that. So we could snap an object onto here, but if I just do that, I know that I'm going to zoom pretty close into it. I'm going to put a null on there. So what we do is I'm just going to add a null to the scene. A null. Snap it to there, and now I can zoom pretty much right into that. If I add some geometry instead, if I hold Alt down and add a sphere instead and make it a tiny sphere, we'll actually have something genuine to snap to. We can just use this now and zoom in really tight. And you can see we're clipping, so if I Control D, do small, it means we can get right tight in. There we go. And I can leave the viewport going. That's no problem. Now, just to show you how the radius stuff works, if I turn off that variation and I hit 100%, you'll see that's filling that exact radius of our spore. But like I said, they're a little large, so I'm going to go for 50% with a 25% variation on the radius. And this is where we're going to swap out the geometry. So this sphere, actually, we can get rid of that. We don't need that anymore. What I'm going to do is in other objects here, I'm going to start building a custom object to sit on the end of these. Now, you can think of this. This could be a leaf, which we did in the Ivy project. It could be a flower. It could be absolutely anything. But in our case, it's going to be a spore. And I'm going to do some stuff here. Oh, in fact, let's get that sphere back. I regret removing that sphere. So we can actually use this sphere as a reference, and it's in the right position for us to test this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create first of all, I'm going to create a sphere that I'm going to clone some smaller spheres onto a larger sphere, and it's going to create this kind of spore grid. So let's just drop this mesh down, and if I display so shading and lines, there we go. We can see that it's a standard sphere at the moment. Change it to icosahedron, and that just means that when we clone spheres onto this, they will be evenly spaced. And let's drop a cloner into the scene and change the cloner to object mode, drop the sphere in, and now I'm going to create another sphere, and since it's over here, I might as well just use this one, Control, and then just drop it in there, and you can see that is now creating a nice looking spore. Now that's only cloning over the surface. So I want to change it to vertex. Like so. And I think perhaps we'll want to change that to like a lower number. I think when you're zoomed out, you won't be able to see that kind of the balls. And if let's start naming these. So we'll call this spore guide sphere. I don't know. There we go. And this is an actual spore. And this is a spores. I'm going to call it bud. That's definitely the wrong word. Just so I know what it is. Let's go for spheres guide, and obviously depending on the radius of these of this guide sphere, that they'll move further out. So you can see that they'll separate a bit too much there. But I'm quite happy with that. Now I don't need to worry at all about the size of this. So I could drop, in fact, if I put these into a null, just so I can group them together and move them around together, and call this Spore geometry. There we go. And I'm going to drop this this cloner into a connect, so it's all one piece. Oh, now can you see what's happened there? This is something I've mentioned before. When you're connecting to just group objects into one piece of geometry, but you don't want them to merge or to weld, if you've got weld on and you've got small scale stuff, it'll start to eat away at the points. So if I turn weld back off, there we go. That's much better. I think we can actually get away with a lower poly count on these as well. Something like that. Because remember, we're going to be zoomed really far out. So compared to this close-up that we've got going on. Okay, so that's the spore bud. Now, like I said, if I scale this all down at once, it doesn't matter what the size is. It also doesn't really matter what the position of it is in the scene. So we're going to use this thing here, which is going to be the spores. Well, it's going to be the spore bud reference. And if I now use this, so the instance tag, and I drag this object into there, you'll see something's weird has happened. First of all, they look tiny, all of these little things. So if I zoom out, we can see them all over the place. So they're in a weird spot because our connect object is at 0. So to fix that, what we can do is, so just to be clear what that is, if I go to the coordinates tab here, our connect object is miles away. Our sphere is all the way over here, but our cloner and our connect object are all the way at 0 point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer our sphere here to the 0. So let's reset PSR. Oh no, sorry, I need to reset the connects PSR. So if I just right click these, there we go. And then the spore geometry itself, I can move that to a 0 point as well. And there we go. Now if I zoom in, we should see our bud on there. And you can see the scaling's off. And it's because the total size of this spore bud is going to be less than 1. So if you're working with geometry, it doesn't automatically normalize that size. We need to be a bit careful about this size in general to make it match the particle. So if it's 1 unit in size, it will match the particle size. So if we just, if I hit Shift F7, this will bring up my coordinates manager. You can see that the actual size of it is only 0.6. So if I turn it to 1, it should scale up. Oh, no. I need to actually manually scale that up. Let's actually go and zoom into it. Oh, maybe, actually, it might not let me. It might be because I'm using the tag here. Let's scale that up. And you can see here, we're scaling it up to about 1. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. Pretty close. There we go. And let's zoom back into our Control Shift V or Command Shift V will get me, Z, sorry, will get me back to the view. And, oh, I've actually scaled down. Because of course, this whole thing is referencing this sphere. So it's actually, all I've done is shrink down the spores. So that's my fault. Let me scale up the sphere. If we think about it, if these are 0.2 or 0.5, and then this is 0.5, that will add up to 1, 0.7, and 0.3. There we go. That, if I Shift F7 that's actually now 2 units. If I press 100% on this, that's actually going to match our particle radius there. So it's the radius of this particle is 1 unit, essentially. So the diameter is 2. Right. Let's check out some other stuff here. So what we could also do is we could add some variation in the, because at the moment these might all be the same orientation depending on how we set the particles up. So what I might do, oh actually let's drop the number of, I actually think I undid a bit too far there. There we go. We could always make these editable at some point as well, by the way. So if you shrink down the outer sphere, we could, I need to scale that back up again. So there we go. And that just means we have a bit of texture to those out in this place. But remember, like I said, the orientation, maybe we want to randomize that, and we can just do that in a tag. So I could just say offset by 360 with a variation of 100%. And that just means each of them has its own random rotation assigned. It's not very obvious on something that's almost spherical, but that's no problem. Okay, so now we've got those set up for ready for rendering. We need to perhaps, well, actually they're quite large, aren't they? So let's shrink that back down again. So 50%. There we go. Nice and fine detail. Is that trail a little bit too thin again? Might thicken the lower part. It just looks like those spores would be struggling to sit on top of that. So I'm going to double the thickness of those again. And now we want to assign the color to them. So we could, there's several methods to do that. We're going to keep it pretty simple. Let's jump to our materials tab here in my layout. So materials manager, in our spores, we could just set the color. So we could just say, set it to a blue color. And if I drag this, now normally you drag materials onto an emitter and that's where it would reference. But because we're using this instance tag and we're using this reference here, we need to put the material on the object that's referenced. So let's just drag that onto there. And you can see those are changed to blue. Awesome. Obviously we don't want them to be blue, but I'll get to that in a second. It looks quite interesting. Let it resolve for a second. I just want to get a feel for this shape and size. But I'm going to make those yellow. I think I'm going to make those a base yellow. But I think what we're going to do is do similar to what we did with the trail object. Yeah, I quite like. Maybe they need to stand out a touch more. Maybe they need to be quite a bright yellow. That's quite nice. I like the fact. I just wanted to do this because I think it looks nicer when this looks like it's coming from the same object. We could, of course, perhaps have the trail be yellow at the bottom and then change as it gets to the top. I'll leave that to you guys to play around with and render your scene however you like it. For now, I'm quite happy with the shade there, but I'm going to change I'm going to give it a bit more randomization. And something that I do a lot in Cycles or any other engine is laziness. And what you can do here is actually we can take these two, because I want the color to be pretty similar to our trail object. What I can do is I can actually grab this little group here of, or this set of nodes. So we've got the color ramp with the colors I want, and I have the range mapping with the hue shift that I want as well. So if I right or select those, we can just copy those and paste those in here. But instead of a trail driving the color, what we can do is we can have the particle info. So remember that was it was the random hairs, but in this case we're going to use the random color on these particles. And you can see it happily assigns those random 0 to 1 value pixel colors or brightnesses to all of our particles. And we just feed that into our input value, like so. And also into our random. Oh, actually, no, we don't want this color ramp we don't actually want the color ramp. So we want a solid color. So all I have to do is I drop that out and then we can actually have our HSV generate the color. So grab this, set this up like so. And now the hue shift is occurring around this color and instead of one that we're inputting, because we don't actually need to feed it any color. We could obviously feed particle color and stuff like that in, but I'm quite liking the look of this. That's just a bit more interest, a bit more texture to it. Visual texture. Awesome. And now when we zoom out here, one thing I don't want it to do is break up the sharp surface as much. So let's go to the time where it's fully grown. We're at the end of the sequence. And I think that's looking pretty good. Give it a second to render. A little dark at the moment. We might pump the brightness. It certainly looks organic. If I zoom in here, that's quite a good area to check out. Yeah. Yeah, I'm liking how that's looking. And I think we'll call that a day for the materials and stuff, and I'll let you play around all you like. The basics are there to go and customize any material. And you can use these random stuff to even blend different types of material into those objects. Or sorry, into those particles. I'm just looking at this. This looks quite cool. It looks like a cave or something with large scale toadstool. Yeah, fungi. That's cool. All right. Well, I'm kind of happy with how this is looking, and I think it's time to throw some cameras in here. Really, I just want a kind of a close to start with, something that we don't really know what's going on, but we can see the growth happening. Then I want a medium, so the close would probably be somewhere probably on the bridge of the nose. I think we'll probably move right to left to start with. Yeah, I want it to be kind of not obvious what's going on quite yet. That's quite fun. Let's add some cameras in. So we're currently probably in our viewport camera. Let's actually change this to an 80mm. So it's quite a long lens. And I think we will pan right to left. What should I say, dolly? There we go. Or orbit, maybe. No, I think we'll go for this. I'm going to add another camera, so I could add a cycles camera. That just gives me and let's call this one shot 01. We might tweak the lighting, but we'll get to that. So early on, around about this point, where are we seeing growth? Well, around the nose, definitely. So I think it's got to be around the mouth and nose is where we're going to check out first. Yeah, this is kind of a mysterious, don't have any idea what's going on. I'm just going to grab a bit of focus. So I'm going to click the focus to be here. And then I'm going to give the aperture a slight radius. Oh, it does look like quite nice with a high depth. The only problem with that, it might take a little longer to render, but if it looks good, go with it. If you have the time to render. I'll probably just bring it in here. Let's give it a keyframe. And then I think this first shot, we're probably going to have it only run for 5 or 6 seconds. Let's do 6. So 6 times 30, give us 180. There we go. Let it load all the geometry back in. We definitely, yeah, I quite like the dark shading, but at the same time, I think we do need to bring some more light in there. Let's move the camera across. I'm just going to have it move across like so. I think that'll be quite a nice shot for 6 seconds. Actually, it does come into the light there quite nicely, so maybe we leave it. Okay, so add a keyframe. It's on auto keyframe, so it probably added one. And I like to have mine linear. For camera moves and stuff like this, I'm gonna set it to linear because I like to keep the motivation moving. So unless it's kind of doing a very exotic move, I like to keep them quite simple with linear keyframes, and then we cut between the shots. So it's up to you how you want to design the camera moves. There we go. I'm going to just duplicate that camera. Oh no, actually I shouldn't do that because it's got keyframes. So that's our first shot. In fact, let's go back to our viewport camera. Let's turn our auto keyframes off. And this will be our second camera. I think maybe from this side. I think that looks pretty cool. Maybe... yeah, if it's... maybe if it's orbiting this way, sort of counterclockwise. And then at the end, I'm just thinking about the end shot. So if I come up here and we end up looking overhead like this. In fact, let's do that shot. Let's add a camera. I think this will be a long lens as well. So let's say shot 3. And then this is basically going to move up. It's going to start down pretty close to the geometry and then probably move up. Here we go. Start down here. I think we're going to have to give this a target as well. So if I add a null and call this, or let's call this target 03. Put that center frame and then add a target tag. So you just search for target tag with the camera selected, drag the target object in. Now we could add an up vector, but I think we should probably be able to get away with it. Let's add a few keyframes. This will definitely need auto keyframes, I think. So we could start here. Remember, this is going to be later on in the shot, so perhaps we start... Well, we definitely start with a bunch of stuff already on the screen. Let's jump around a bit. I'm trying to do it on round numbers. Bit of a habit. Not entirely necessary. Now remember, it's targeting, so we're only moving the camera here. I want to be higher up. Now, it depends, I kind of want to land sort of not completely fully out before it's all formed. Like here, maybe. But we're getting a really good idea of what's going on by now. That's looking pretty cool. And then by the time we've... Well, do we go to 600? Maybe 600 might be a bit long, so let's do 500. And then this is going to be our last frame. Somewhere about here. And I might give it a bit of a pitch rotation. Sorry, a bank rotation. Just so that it makes it look a bit more deliberate. There we go. So that's looking pretty cool. Nice. And I would encourage you to come up with better camera moves than me. It might not suit, and putting them together this quickly might not work as well. You see, I love this growing along here and stuff, and then it follows with the furry stuff as well. So that's cool. And remember, we're going to cut to this later on in the timeline, but it doesn't matter too much because the other two shots, let's actually set that other shot up. So this other shot is going to be, well, I think it's going to be a wide shot. Down here, maybe. Oh, let's render. Oh yeah, that's actually really interesting. So what we'll do is, because that other camera is kind of swinging, which way was it swinging? That was swinging clockwise, wasn't it, to get up to here. So let's do an anti-clockwise rotation here. Or even just a movement this way. So because we're moving left to right that way, let's do right to left. Yeah, let's do the opposite way, this way. Okay, let's start somewhere like this. Let's start it back. Oh, classic. Got auto keyframes on, but that's not the point we want it to be on. It's not even the camera we want it to be on. So let's remove the keyframes from that. Add our actual camera. What a classic rookie mistake there. Let's put it as shot 2. Shot 02. Could always add the layer there. Assign that as the main, as the render camera. And right, where do we want to start? So maybe back. This is the second shot, remember? So maybe back at frame 80. Just set that first keyframe as frame 80. And then move on. It doesn't have to be crazy long. I mean, 80 plus 6 seconds maybe. So 80 plus 6 was there. Oops, because I jumped a bit far. Let it load the geometry again. I still want it to be kind of obscure as to what's going on. And then the reveal's a bit later on. But I am quite liking the way that's looking. So that's 6 seconds moving across left to right there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that's nice. And then the last shot is going to be the long one until we come out. I mean, I might cut into it a bit, sort of further into it. Now let me turn off. If you want faster playback, of course, we could pause the render itself and then just turn off these two systems, and the playback will be much more real time. So let's see this move. That's looking good. I think I might want it to be, I think I've got a keyframe in there somewhere halfway down. I think it might be able to just be a constant move. I think adding keyframes always adds like a complexity that you might not need. So let's turn this back on and turn the mesh off. Oh, and also let's change. Can you see our particles are flickering? That reminds me, our project settings are set to view clipping of small. Set it to large, press play. Oh, I think that's looking quite nice. Problem is when does it hit that wider point? Oh, I think that's good actually. Excellent. We could always do a ramp or a speed up in post. The only issue with that obviously is we're rendering more frames, but we're going to render these anyway, so I quite like that. All right, let's turn those back on actually. Oops, not the cache. Turn that one on, turn this one on. Just catch a few frames to check them out before rendering. And I think we could probably call that, if we want to boost that brightness. What I'll probably do is I'll boost the brightness and stuff in post. We're not going to be doing too much post, probably some regular stuff, such as the, oh, I've turned that off again. Such sort of regular stuff like blooms and things like that. Because we've got depth of field baked into the shots, we're not going to need that. So that's a good point actually. Let's turn some depth of field on. Make sure our auto keyframing is off. Oh, that's I think we'll set our target as our focus point. Go into the camera, use the target object as our focus distance. And that's way too shallow, of course. It makes it look much smaller than it actually is. I don't think the target's going to work actually because it's inside the nose of the... Let's create a focus. So focus for the O3. I like to number it. If I've got iterations, it's good to number them the same. So jump into shot, camera, uncheck use target object, and this is the focus object rather than the target. And then actually we could put the snapping back on. So I like to open that up, enable snapping, and then if I've got polygon surface, we can snap it to the surface and we've got like a focus helper. I'm going to put that kind of at the front of the nose there, or top of the mouth, I guess. There we go, and I think it's still way too high, so, oh, we didn't change it, that's why. We could use f-stop, we could change it to f-stop, and if everything was at scale, that would work out. I actually don't know, I don't think this is currently, yeah, that's 10 times larger than it would be in reality, so the f-stops might not be very useful here. So I just like to use the radius, get a nice look. 0.3. Where this will affect most is at the early on where we're kind of on the ground here. And I'm liking that. So it's just enough to throw out the background. Okay. And finally, let's just pump out a bit to here. Jump into the other cameras. Shot 2. Now this definitely needs this one definitely needs a focus point, and I think we probably just set it to the chin there, and that'll be sweet for the shot because it's not rotating or anything. I quite like that 0.5 value, 0.05. There we go. That's looking pretty sweet to me. And like I said, we can mess around with loads of stuff in the grade. But for now, I think we're probably ready to render that. And that's what we're going to go and do. Oh, actually, well, let's just check the render settings before we go. I don't always address these, but because everyone has their own ways of tweaking these things. But let's take a look. Now, I'm definitely going to want more samples than that. I'm going to render 1080p. So lock ratio, 1920 with 1080. I'm going to do 0 to 500 frames. And then I'm going to add a multipass. I'm going to probably do OpenEXR. I like sort of high bit depth formats. Change it to 16-bit. We could do lossy, and use 16-bit floats, but for now I think that's going to be fine. Obviously assign a name and a location for it to be saved. Now if I enable multipass and I right click it, now because I'm using cycles, I need to add a post effect multipass. Jump into cycles and go to the render elements tab, and then we've got these options here. Now what we could do here is we could use a mist pass to kind of throw out the depth of things, but I don't think we're going to need that too much. We could use object IDs and material IDs. Now material IDs might be a good idea here. So if I click on a material, say it's our slime mold, and if I go to the materials settings tab, you'll see I have this material ID. So let's give this a unique ID. So it can be anything. I tend to start, if they're kind of similar materials, I tend to start them at like a hundreds value. So I'll say 300 for this. And then I'll say 301 for the trail spores. And then I'll do 301 for the spores themselves, just because... Oh, I should add some roughness to those, actually. Not that matters too much. But what that means is now those will both output an ID that will include those two. We could use Cryptomat, but I don't think we need it for this because really we're only using a couple of IDs and it's not going to cost us too much in render time and render size, file size, I should say. Okay, so I'm going to check material IDs on, and that's pretty much all I want. If I want to boost, say, the glossiness, I could render out that separately, but really I'm quite happy with how this is looking, and I think we can tweak it to the point where we're going to be happy. Okay, so let's make sure our one last checks and all that stuff here. Now I'm going to set an alpha to on. Now in cycles, you'll want to go to the cycles 4D post effect here, yep, and jump to the film. And make sure that it's set to transparent background. Now I'm hiding the background at the moment, but if I've got the viewport showing as is now, let's play a little bit, play a different part of the thing, and let's cycle or toggle through these, and you can see in the background our alpha. This is what our alpha is going to look like. Obviously this shot is not the best one to demonstrate that with. So there we go, there's shot 2. And you can see we've got that. Oh, sorry, that's shot 1. There's shot 2. Yeah, so we got that nice silhouette, and this is what our alpha is going to look like. I don't think I'm going to change it from being on black, but if you ever did want to do that, obviously alphas are important. So that's what this transparent film allows us to do, even if we were rendering the background. So if we were displaying the background, it would allow us to display the alpha. So you want to check that on, and save that, and then I tend to uncheck multi-layer file in OpenEXRs or whichever format I'm doing. I just like to have them as separates. If you want to be convenient, use it as a convenience format, you can have multi-layer, but I think it's absolutely fine. And then of course we save it out, and we're going to render it, and we're going to mess around with it in After Effects, just tweak some of the colors and play around with those IDs. Other than that, I think we could call that completed on the render section of the Infectio.